Hi, everyone, and welcome to our discussion today on thematic ETFs. I'm really thrilled to have Cinthia Murphy from the ETF think tank join me today. Hi, Cinthia. How's it going?
Hey, John. So glad to be here today.
Cinthia, why don't you start with introducing yourself, and then we can dive right in.
Yeah, so I'm Cinthia Murphy. I am the head of research for the ETF think tank, which is the research content arm of Tidal Financial Group. I have a long past in the media side. I worked for many years at ETF.com. And so I've joined this group in January. So I'm going on my first year here, and it's been a lot of fun.
Outstanding. And I'm John O'Connell. I'm the CEO of the Oasis Group. I've also recently published a book called The Rise of the Activist Investor. And we're going to talk today about thematic ETFs. So, Cinthia, why don't we start with telling everyone what's a thematic ETF, and then we can talk about what makes them successful.
Yeah, so the way we look at thematic ETFs at the tank is really typically a cross-sector type of portfolio where all the securities in there have some kind of commonality underlying business line. Or so if you think of cybersecurity as a theme, you may have stocks in there that are software providers, some are hardware, some are infrastructure names. So you have different sectors represented within that theme. So by design, these tend to be very diversified portfolios that capture what I like to think of sectors for the way we live today. So, when you think of these segments in a way that makes sense, they're very intuitive typically. And they tell great stories because it's easy to understand a theme in a way that sometimes sectors or factors or smart beta fall short.
I completely agree. I mean, if you think about the way we look at it at the Oasis Group are, in some extent, the riches are in the niches, right? These are very specialized ETFs that try to follow a specific theme and offer their investors the ability to either target a specific segment of the market that they want to see, or a specific behavior that they want to see. And I know you and I will talk a lot about ESG and SRI and some of those other ETFs that we're seeing emerge. But why don't we first talk a little bit about who buys thematic ETFs and where's the sales start? Does it start with the wealth manager where the issuer discusses it with the wealth manager, or does it just start with an issuer really marketing that over to the individual consumer? I mean, you and I had a conversation leading up to this around QQQ and what we're seeing in the market, where QQQ is advertising quite a bit in the marketplace. And I know you and I will talk about they're a little bit of an anomaly, but I think we at the Oasis Group we see a lot where the investor is approaching their wealth manager and says, well, I would like to have something that either A, reflects my value set, or B, I'm very interested in space exploration. So what do you have out there that has investments that can match the direction that I want to go in? And I see it more as the consumer bringing it to the wealth manager. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so I was looking at some of the data on just basic general ETF ownership earlier this month, and what's interesting is if you look based on the data that's available, so like 13F filings, for example, about a third of ETF ownership today sits with the advisory channel, which makes sense. What is interesting though is that about also another third sits directly with the retail. So a lot of the growth has been in that do-it-yourself, go straight to your brokerage account and buy the ticker that you like. And I think thematics are a great fit for that crowd because they're stories that are easy to understand typically. So you may not go to your own brokerage account and go look for a really complex leverage full of bells and whistles, options related strategy. You may seek, financial advice for that. But in a lot of the thematic space, they tend to be very intuitive, like we mentioned earlier. And so they find a strong following among the do-it-yourself directly to retail, almost like a B2C phenomenon in the thematic space, more so than in other parts of the ETF space. So I think has been a lot of growth among retail, but definitely the advisory channel is where the bulk of assets sit, as we know. And, who's starting the conversation, the client or the advisor? It's a great question, actually. I think we need to ask some advisors if they're bringing the ideas to the table or are they challenged to find the answer to the questions.
I would agree with you. I think there's so much opportunity now in the retail space, right? People have access to their brokerage accounts literally on their phone. So they can do a lot more research themselves and really find some of these thematic ETFs that they find exciting or that match kind of the direction that they want to go in. It's funny you mentioned the K-pop ETF earlier in your discussion, right? There's an ETF that's really kind of geared towards a very specific set of the market, people who follow or like K-pop culture and going after, or want to be involved in that kind of those kind of investments. So it's really interesting. I think what we're seeing with this huge growth in the thematic space is really driven by these niches that we see out there. But not everyone's successful, as we were talking about leading up to this, right? There's a lot of, unfortunately, there's a lot of thematic ETFs that we find in the graveyard. I know you had mentioned that it's kind of, we're seeing a little bit of as many of thematic ETFs that are being created, there's as many of them that are being closed. Why don't we kind of cover a little bit of that too?
Yeah, so, coming in our conversation today, I was trying to find, what are the lessons we can learn here, both from what we call the Hall of Famers in thematic. So the big, successful funds out there in this category, also from the ones that have closed, so the thematic graveyard. So if you look at the Hall of Famers, the ones that have had that staying power, you have things there like natural resources funds like Gunner. You have things like cyber, the cybersecurity ETF, CIBR from First Trust. You have lithium ETF, which was one of the first real thematic plays that kind of put in motion this idea of really segmenting the market based on themes. And then, of course, you have RKK, the Disruptive Innovation ETF, which is such a great study case for everything that's good, bad, ugly within thematics in general. So, ARK is a fund that, does it tell you that the success of a thematic ETF hinges on just the longevity of the investment case, the viability of the story, or is it just as much the lightning in a bottle? It just worked. It was the right time, the right place, the right strategy, and it just catches on fire. So to a lot of people, I think we think of ARK as that lightning in a bottle. It went in 2020, 2021, it just went crazy. Everybody had to own it. Every story mentioned ARK. It dominated the conversation, the flows, the performance charts, everything. But if you think so, you could argue time, place, market environment for that kind of strategy makes all the chips fall into place to the success of a thematic ETF. But if you think also ARK, it launched in 2014. In its first year, he gathered $1 million. In the second year, he gathered $3 million. In the third year, he gathered $4 million. So this is the lightning in a bottle that took 6 years to get there. So is it longevity of investment case? Yes. So I think it's just such an interesting space because you could argue that the success of a thematic ETF, that longevity, is this an investment case that's also going to be meaningful 5 years from now, 10 years from now? If that's the case, you're much more likely to succeed. But there's also the element of timing and luck, which are the things you can't control. And so sometimes you see success that you didn't expect, and you see failures that you didn't expect. So if you look at closures in thematic ETFs in the past year, you have things that in theory could have succeeded. Like there was an ETF that caught my eye, which is the luxury goods ETF. Well, during the pandemic, actually luxury goods names did phenomenally well. It totally outperformed the broader retail segment. Everybody used their checks from the government to invest in their luxury items, and yet that ETF as a theme didn't survive. So was it the timing that wasn't right, or is it the fact that, which is my ongoing theory right now, that in the thematic space is where you tend to see a lot of the innovation, but you also tend to see a lot of the small, newer issuers come. Because there's not a lot of white space in the traditional beta. There's not a lot of white space in active management unless that's your expertise. So they tend to come into thematics. And, can you actually keep your ETF running 1 year, 2 year, 3 years before it gets that track record that hits the advisory channel? And so, I think a lot of thematic ETF closures could actually say more about whether these issuers can survive that rather than the viability of the strategy itself, if it makes sense.
I completely agree. I mean, if you take a look at cyber, you brought that one up, right? That was not the first to the market. Hack was the first to the market. And yet cyber's really kind of dominated that space. Right now, they're sitting at just over 4 billion of assets under management. So it's very interesting, right? It doesn't seem like timing's the one that really wins the day, so to speak. It seems that there's just more to it than timing, because the first movers, as you and I have talked about, don't always win. So is it, how do you figure out that lightning in a bottle? I think we need a little bit more time with the space to figure that out. But I agree with you. A lot of the issuers that you do see tend to be smaller issuers that are getting into this, or new issuers that are getting into this. Another example that we could talk about at this point that's near and dear to my heart are these new activist investing ETFs that are coming out, right? So Vote came out from engine number one, which was really successful in their campaign against Exxon, and they now have 3 board seats for Exxon. A clear case of an activist investor that's kind of coming to market. Right now, they're at about 385 million of assets under management. They were launched about a year ago, a little over a year ago. In contrast to that, you find some of the other ones that are out there, like Active, ACTV, which that's LeaderShares Activist Investor Fund. It really focuses on equities that are already under or have already been notified by an activist investor that they're seeking board changes. That fund has not done that well, right? It's sitting at about 85 million of assets under management at this point. So, but both of them came out around the same time. So what's different about engine number one than what you're seeing on the LeaderShares ETF? You could argue, is engine number one more well known now because they've been written about so much, and there's been so much press about their success against Exxon. Is it brand recognition, right? That's really driven some of that, and not necessarily timing. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question.
Yeah, I think the first hurdle you got to cross is, are you innovating? Are you innovating in access, or are you innovating in fees? You got to be innovating in something. If you are just a Me Too fund, it's that much harder to overcome. That said, to Cyber's example, you can be second to market and still find a following. I think with the thematic space, it's all about the story. Are you out there telling the story? And I think some companies do that a lot better than others. We say this all the time, that ETFs aren't bought, they're sold. Well, selling is marketing, it's storytelling, is, being out there, making the case for that investment idea. So I think some firms just do it well. I mean, it sounds so silly, but do you have a spokesperson for this product that really goes out there and resonates with the potential buyer? That makes a difference. And I also think tickers make a difference. We looked at it recently. And if you think about how we communicate in the ETF space, we don't sit there and rattle out the whole name of an ETF. We just mention the ticker. So the ticker becomes synonymous with that strategy. Yeah. So do you have a clever ticker, a catchy ticker that people are going to remember? Or is it, letter soup? And so I think all these little details, which in isolation may seem a little silly, all together help you find that following and stick with it. But if you go back to ARK, it's not a particularly brilliant ticker. It's the company name and then has a letter attached to the end for all of the ARK funds. In that case, I think it's 100% that storytelling. And if you find the conviction crowd, that conviction trade, then they stay with you. I mean, ARK is a great example of, I don't know of a better example of the importance of conviction in the thematic space. If you think about the performance it's had this year, it's down like 60 something percent, and it's picked up $1.5 billion. It was down 23% last year, and it picked up $4.5 billion. So it's just that conviction trade is so important in the thematic space. Can you create that? I don't know the secret to that. Maybe that's where the little bit of luck comes into play. But it's all about getting that story out there and telling it well.
I would agree. I think that when you look at thematic ETFs, they're a microcosm really to the entire ETF market in some respects, right? You've got to have a really great story to tell. You've got to be able to get out there, build brand recognition around the new product that you've got, really have that kind of spokesperson that's out there talking about the product and educating, not just, now it seems, as we were discussing earlier, not just the wealth management teams anymore, right? You've got to educate the wealth management teams and the retail investors. So one could argue it's becoming somewhat more expensive to be able to launch a thematic ETF because you've got two different go-to-market strategies that you've got to be able to focus on, I think, to drive a lot of success in this space. ARK, you can ask a lot of people that are not traditional wealth managers about Cathie Wood and ARK, and they will know who they are, right? For lack of a better term. So how have they built that brand recognition? How have they gone out and really positioned that? I think that you're seeing there's so many new ETFs that are being created on an annualized basis. That's becoming more and more, I think, a trend that you're seeing. And it's more emphasized in this thematic space.
Yeah, I think what Cathie Wood and ARK built is what every thematic ETF provider wants. I know all the publicity around Cathie Wood is very controversial and polarizing and all that stuff, but the truth is, a couple of years ago, when I went to a carpet store to price out a runner for my stairs in my house, the guy who installed the carpet asked me, "Oh, are you in ETFs? Have you ever met Cathie Wood? Because my son wants to buy ARK." And this was like, grocery store type of conversation. And when you become that kind of a household name, I mean, you're golden. And I think that it's just a phenomenal experience. But, can you recreate that? There is no secret to it. But I think, what a lot of the small issuers maybe don't realize, or they come with this expectation that Cathie Wood and ARK is a lightning in a bottle situation, is that it actually isn't. It's persistence. I was at a conference recently and they were talking about social media, but I think the lesson applies, which is everyone wants to just go on Twitter once, put a tweet, go viral and make it. The truth is like going to the gym. You got to go 3 times a week and repeat it. And eventually that gain compounds. And I think in the ETF space is a little bit of the same thing. It takes time. And if you have to be able to keep supporting that product if you want that product to make it.
I completely agree. And I think that what we're seeing around this specialization, I think that's where, it's funny, you mentioned that the vast majority of the ETFs that closed last year were traditional ETFs, right? Thematics have kind of stayed a little bit steady. When you think about the niche play that you've got in a thematic ETF, I agree with you. I think the consistency of your strategy is what draws people to your ETF in the thematic space, certainly. I think that you've got some of these flashes in the pan like FOMO and meme that are interesting ETFs, but they're not really getting a lot of traction, right? Because they're not really focusing on a specific niche in the marketplace, like you see with some of the space ETFs, the activist investing ETFs, the cybersecurity ETFs, the clean energy ETFs. Those have a very clear mission that people can readily understand, and I think they're attracted to those. Whereas some of the more like the meme one or the FOMO, those are not getting as much traction. And I think it's because they lack that specialization that people look for when they look at a thematic ETF.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be both, actually. I think it can be whether, what are you putting that thematic ETF in? Is it a long-term holding in your portfolio that is a diversifier to different things, or the conviction on that story? Or is it more of a trading tool that's tactical in nature? It's a short-term opportunity. If you think about themes that emerged during the pandemic, like all the work from home ETFs and virus and, mRNA ETFs, all these things, do they have legs? Are they going to be here 10 years from now? I don't know. Maybe work from home is going to be a continuously evolving theme and continue to be an interesting story. Or it could be that they had a time and place and they will come and go. I think if we look at the graveyard of ETFs, there's a lot of that shows you where we were in time, where markets were, and why that made sense then. It may not make so much sense now. But I do also think, if you look at where the product development is headed, there is a place for thematic ETFs to become the narrower and more focused they are. They also can become kind of hedging tools to other parts of your portfolio in interesting ways. And I think it's what we talk a little bit internally here at the Tank as, the ETF as a service idea. And it's just this wrapper, this technology to package a very, very focused solution that serves a very specific goal in your portfolio. And I think thematics is a space where we're seeing that happen a little bit. And so there's a lot of exciting moving pieces there.
I would agree with you. Let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing with, is thematic, what's the future for thematic ETFs, right? We're seeing this huge rise right now in direct indexing, SMA accounts. Where do you think that's going to go? And then I'll weigh in on where I think it's going as well.
Yeah, so I think there's two interesting things, and one of them is really your area of expertise. So I really want to hear what you have to say, which is the whole ESG activist conversation. I think if you look at a lot of the innovation and a lot of I would say even trial and error on the thematic product development side has been on that ESG. If you look at just launches within the thematic sleeve in the last year, within that ESG conversation, you have very different strategies from, we have Orphan, the anti-ESG, and then you have Justice, and then you have broader environment, you have carbon transition, and then you have the opposite of that. There's a lot of things going around pulling in different directions there. So I think there's a lot of interesting product development there. For more broadly speaking, the future of thematic ETFs, it actually looks a little cloudy to me. And I say that because there isn't really a lot of white space. What's a theme that hasn't been explored yet? It's really hard to look ahead and think of a new area that needs an ETF strategy for. I think with the ETF rule that came out, like streamlining the launch of ETFs, and the derivatives rule that really opened the door to derivatives used in ETFs in a very, very specific and more aggressive ways, if you will, I think we actually could be reinventing the definition of a thematic ETF and start seeing things like, a portfolio of 4 electric vehicle stocks and with some leverage to it. And that's the new EV thematic ETF, but very laser focused that you can use to get that super specific exposure. You can use for tax management come tax season. You can use to hedge other positions in your portfolio. So I think it could be that thematic ETFs are going to be moving from this broad diversification baskets to really, really, really narrow focused tools because of new regulation that now opens the door for that kind of strategy. So I think it's actually an exciting time to see where product development takes us.
I agree. I think it is a very exciting time. I think what you're going to see with thematic ETFs is twofold. I think that you're going to see, because that door has now been opened, you're going to see ETFs that are being created for very specific investment strategies that you want to be able to achieve within your portfolio. I also think with this rise of the activist investor, with activist investing growing, I think you're going to see more and more ETFs that are being created that are niche ETFs that match, for example, the personal values of some of the investors. when you think about the Knights of Columbus ETF that was just launched, a lot of the faith-based investing ETFs that have been launched recently, and you start really considering some of the other ESG and SRI ETFs. First, let me say, ESG, I think, is a terrible overall umbrella to describe the market that
I
is,
agree.
right?
I agree.
And if you look at ESG just in and of itself, there's 168 factors that really you track within ESG. And if we think about just G, the governance piece of that, right? You can track factors like the number of women on a board of directors, the number of minorities on a board of directors, shareholder representation, independence of the board of directors. Is the chairman the CEO of the board? There are so many factors that just fall under G, governance. So I think that the broad ESG ETFs that have been out there, I think you're going to see some of those lose AUM, and you're going to see that moving to much more targeted ETFs that are not as broad ESG, but are focused on very specific things like governance or like carbon emissions or like overall green sustainability. That is a direction I think you're going to see. So if I take a look at where we are today, I agree with you. I think that it's a little gray of what's going to happen with thematic ETFs moving forward. But if I try to peer into my crystal ball, I think we're going to see some of those ETFs become very specialized for investment strategies. And I think you're going to see some of these ETFs become very specialized around the overall personal values of some of the investors. And I think you're already seeing some of that demand, right? Where you're seeing some investors really move towards SMA accounts, that's because they're trying to either achieve a very specific investment strategy, or they really are trying to have their values be more reflected in their investments. They want their money to reflect their personal value set. And I think you're going to see that more and more. It'll be very interesting to see what products are created, though, over the next 12 months. If we look at the last 12 months, we've seen these huge numbers of new products being created kind of across the spectrum. I think it'll be very interesting to see what plays out in the next 12 months and whether or not we're going to see some of that more and more specialization. I think we will, but we'll see.
I agree. I mean, yeah, from inflation to Korean entertainment, we've seen it all. So who knows what comes next?
We've seen it all, including, and like you had mentioned, the Be Your Own Boss, the BYOB.
Yeah,
exactly. That's an interesting one. There's so many really interesting ETFs that are being created out there in that thematic space that it'll be very, very cool to see what winds up getting created in the next year. If there's one thing that we both know, being in this industry for this long, change is a constant. So it's going to be really, really interesting to see where it goes. Yeah.
Well, John, I wanted to thank you for having us on this show today. It's been a really, really cool conversation. I'm sure we could talk about this for hours. So
you and I could talk about it for hours. You and I could definitely talk about it for hours. Unfortunately, we are probably running up on time. I want to thank you for joining me too. I think this is a great conversation between us. And it'll be really, let's see where things go from here.
Sounds good. Thanks all.
Well, thank you.